The Checkpoint is presented by GM Pharma, the first international multinational pharmaceutical company in Georgia. GM Pharma, to serve those who need it most.
Here's the interview with Jonathan Tower, founder and managing partner of Catapult VC, a venture investment fund interested in Georgia and its startups. Thank you for your time, first of all, and I would like to know in the very beginning, why are you interested in investing in Georgia, and what's your experience in Georgia as well?
Yes, so I've been coming to Georgia pretty regularly for the last 3 to 4 years. I first got introduced to Georgia. I was invited to be a startup VC judge for the JITA program back in 2018, 2019, and I've been a judge at every batch since. And so I've seen a steady progression in the quality of startups coming out of not only JITA, but also the broader Georgian tech ecosystem. And so we believe that Georgia has an opportunity to be a dominant tech hub for the Caucasus. And my firm, as a focus, specializes in investing in what we consider underserved tech ecosystems. And we believe Georgia has the opportunity to really grow in the next 5 to 10 years. And we want to be the first firm to come here to build a practice.
How can you assess Georgian startup ecosystem? As far as I know, you know our country well enough already. Well,
I've been assessing it for the last 3 to 4 years. Like I mentioned, I've been seeing the startups that have come through the program. And if you are aware of how the program works, there are hundreds and hundreds of startups go through the boot camp, and then they get curated down to about 50 to 75 companies. And then I have the privilege of seeing those companies pitch. So I get a good sense after 50 pitches over 2 or 3 days, really the overall quality of the very best startups coming out of Georgia. So having done that now 6 or 7 times, I've got a pretty good sense about the quality of the companies. And like I said, I think that quality has been increasing every time I've done it. And so that was one of the reasons why we decided that this is the right time to spin up a fund.
According to your experience in Silicon Valley, what kind of challenges do they face, especially in developing countries like in Georgia? What kind of challenges do startups face?
Yeah, there are a number of challenges. I think one of them is that in markets like Georgia, there isn't much of a venture ecosystem here. There aren't that many venture investors. Sometimes there are no venture investors. There are angels. And unfortunately, although they may be well-meaning, a lot of the angel investors in smaller markets, they're not experienced investors. They don't necessarily understand how to do venture investing, right? The angel investors typically made their money in other industries. So maybe they made their money in real estate or manufacturing. That's fine, but it's not tech investing. And so one of the problems that creates is that the type of investments that they make in startups tend to make it hard for startups to raise more money after that particular financing round. So when they try to present to firms like us in Silicon Valley, it's very difficult for us to invest in those startups because they made a lot of mistakes in raising capital from angel investors. So one of the challenges is educating angel investors in these markets to understand what the best practices are for startup investing so that they can give those startups the best chance that they can to become globally successful.
You already mentioned that you see steady progression here in Georgia. Can you specify in which field do you see this progression?
Well, I don't say it's a particular field. I mean, the startups are working in all sorts of areas, right? It's consumer e-commerce, it's enterprise, it's frontier technologies, there's a number of different sectors, and every batch has startups that touch upon something. So I can't tell you that there's one particular sector that Georgia has found a real core competency in. I think broadly across the companies that we see, the overall quality has gone up. And I think what's also important is that we're now seeing startups coming out of Georgia that are being accepted into tier 1 venture acceleration programs like Y Combinator and other programs that are quite prestigious. And because of that, it's a good positive signal to show that the startups coming out of Georgia are now being recognized globally by other investors, not just by us.
And giving some advice, like what kind of skills do they need to be successful in this huge market like Silicon Valley?
Yeah, so I mean, the startup skills are no different than they would be in the US, right? Startups need to think about go-to-market, building a product and service, building teams properly, all the typical disciplines that every startup needs to understand. The problem or the challenge in a market like Georgia is that you haven't been doing this very long. It's a fairly new phenomenon where startup investing, building startups in Silicon Valley, they've been doing that for 70, 80 years. And so there's a lot more experience in those markets. And so what we try to do is to leverage that when we come to Silicon Valley by helping those startups, given the fact that we've been doing this for so long. And we also bring lots of other partners with us that also have deep experience in understanding what those skills are and then mentoring the startups in Georgia to acquire those skills so they can be successful internationally.
Let's proceed talking about your plans in Georgia in this fund. And when is sought to approve one of the first projects? What are you working on for now?
Yeah, so we just recently announced our intentions to do a fund here in Georgia. We're very fortunate to have JITA and the government of Georgia as an anchor investor in the fund. That was a very important part of how we come to markets like Georgia. We always want to bring in local investors that provide us credibility, access, reputation. And so having the government of Georgia and the JITA program as an anchor investment in the fund is a huge thing for us and a real feather in our cap. But it's the beginning. We are fundraising now. We are having active conversations with other investors in Georgia to raise additional capital. And then once we get to a certain number, we will then be able to raise capital outside of Georgia, right? So there's a process with how we actually put a fund together. And this will take several months as we go to market with the fund. In terms of when we expect to make our first investments in the fund, we'd like to do it by the end of the year, early part of next year. We already have probably a dozen startups that we have in our pipeline that we have had early conversations with, we have vetted, that we believe once we are in a position to deploy capital, we would like to invest in those startups. So we think it'll probably be a couple of months before we begin deploying capital, but once we're up and running, we'll be doing that on a fairly regular basis.
And you know that tax system is very important also in terms of developing some new projects, especially in this country, in Georgia. How can you assess how flexible is Georgian tax system? What do you think from your point of view?
Taxes?
Tax system, yeah.
I mean, it's fairly flexible. I mean, there are areas that we'd like to work with the government to put together different types of infrastructure that's a bit more startup friendly, a bit more investor friendly, but it takes a while, right? It's not something that's going to happen overnight, but we invest at very early stage. And so it's not as big of a concern for us at this point because most of the startups that we invest with don't have big revenue, they don't have big tax exposure. And so we're able to invest in markets like Georgia, where some of the tax regulatory environment may not be as favorable as we'd like it to be. But I think over time, we'll work with the government and other entities in Georgia to put together not just taxes, but other regulatory issues. So a bankruptcy law, labor law, all that is very important to startups, but also to attract investors to Georgia. They want to see parity with other markets like the US and Europe so that when they invest in Georgia, they're not going to be surprised by how they will be treated as investors in that market. And that takes time. That takes time to work with the government to help them understand the infrastructure to put in place to attract investors such as us.
When we are talking about labor law, for example, on the one hand, we have a little bit cheap workforce in Georgia, you know about it, but on the other hand, there is some kind of deficit in some fields in terms of qualified professionals. How can you assess our environment in this way?
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. I think clearly it's a less expensive market to operate, and that is attractive because as an investor, that means we get a lot more leverage on our capital in Georgia. Our money goes further in Georgia than it would be in the US or in parts of Europe that are much more expensive. That's a very big advantage for Georgia, and I think Georgia can take advantage of that to grow its ecosystem. On the negative side, you're correct. There are some deficits. We do have some talent areas that aren't quite as developed, where we need to work with the educational environment, the university environment, to develop programs over time to improve the quality of the technical education. The rest is just experience. I think a lot of the experiential deficits we see is because the teams here haven't done this for very long. And so it's difficult to find 50 candidates that have experience in go-to-market strategies, 50 candidates that have built products from 0 to 60 and taken a company to a level of outcome that you might find in New York or San Francisco. But every market has that problem. And so it does take time, but we believe we're at a point in time for Georgia where we're getting some excitement around the ecosystem here. People are looking at Georgia in a way they didn't several years ago. And we think once we spin up the fund here, we'll have an ability to attract other entrepreneurs who may not be in Georgia right now. Maybe they're in Ukraine, maybe they're in Belarus, who would like to maybe come to Georgia and bring their technical skills to Georgia and become part of the Georgian tech ecosystem.
Do you expect to see Georgian local business and companies in this fund as well, to cooperate with them as well? You're waiting for them, I'm saying.
Yeah, so we do, and we're already getting some inbound interest and some commitments from local businesses in Georgia. Yeah, I mean, the banks, we'd like them to be in. We think they will be. It makes a lot of sense for the banks to be affiliating with us, because you have to think about, from their perspective, startup ecosystem, these are all going to be potential bank clients. Startups need banking services. As they grow and they get larger, they're going to need all sorts of financial services. Those banks want to provide those services, so it's good for their business to have the capacity to service startups as clients. But also, from a branding and messaging perspective, the idea of science, technology, and innovation is critically important for economic growth in markets like Georgia, right? The future of Georgia are these types of jobs. And so every bank, I think, here in Georgia would like to be considered part of this movement. Would like to be considered a forward-thinking, future-focused bank, not a bank of the past. And so I think by working with us, not only will it be able to build a portfolio of startup clients that are affiliated with us as potential portfolio companies, but also they want to be perceived by the Georgian population as a technology-focused bank, a bank of the future, fueling the future of Georgia.
And today, what can you say, what's your long-term plans in Georgia?
So our long-term plans are in Georgia is we are building a long-term relationship with Georgia. We are not doing just one fund. The name of the fund is Catapult Georgia #1. That implies we're going to have Catapult Georgia #2, 3, 4, 5, and so forth. So we are building the infrastructure in place now with the partners and the collaborations that we have in place to have a team here for the foreseeable future. And we think that as we build this first fund, within short order, we'll be thinking about doing possibly a regional fund that will be investing in not only Georgian companies, but companies in the Caucasus, companies in Central Asia, because it all connects the ecosystem to each other, right? Georgian companies, as they grow, they're going to probably want to penetrate the Armenian market, the Azerbaijan market, go to Ukraine, go to Belarus. There are other markets that they want to go to before they come to the US. And so for us to have boots on the ground in those markets is advantageous for us, it's advantageous for our companies. So as we grow our platform, that is more assets that we can leverage for our startups here.
Thank you for your time. We are looking forward to upcoming projects as well and meeting with you as well.
Thank you for having me.
The Checkpoint is presented by GM Pharma, the first international multinational pharmaceutical company in Georgia. GM Pharma, to serve those who need it most.